Welcome to another edition of Special Report Online. I'm Brett Baer. Thanks for joining us tonight. If you haven't been here before, welcome aboard. It's a place a little bit more relaxed. You can ask questions, make comments. Our panel is here, along with our special guest, Utah Republican Senator Mike Lee. Thanks for sticking around. People are logging in, and, well, first of all, they said it's frightening to see the kicker and the number of people who are out of touch. But, Senator, I want to ask you about today. You had the Attorney General in the Judiciary Committee. A lot of the questions focusing on the NSA and the back and forth. What did you take from that testimony? And do you feel comfortable overall keeping this metadata operation in place?
Well, I certainly don't feel comfortable with keeping the metadata operation in place without having some very significant restraints on the ability of the government to search that database with respect to American citizens. That really is personal information, and there is a lot of opportunity for abuse there if somebody wants to target an American citizen.
But yet they don't have one example of an aggrieved person, not one.
Yeah, the fact that we can't come up with something with respect to an agency that operates by necessity in secret doesn't mean that there haven't been abuses, and it certainly doesn't mean that there won't be abuses in the future. Look, we think back to the Frank Church hearings. We think back to other episodes in American history. We've seen this movie before. We know how it ends. We know that eventually technology like this is going to be abused unless we put significant restraints on the government.
But if you have a FISA court that is actively engaged, and each time now that they want to query that data, they have to go to a court. That seems like at least a barrier to abuse, does it not?
Yes, it does. And if there were, by law, some requirement to that effect, anytime they wanted to query that database with respect to an American citizen, then that would cause a lot of people, including myself, to be comforted. But currently, there is nothing in law that requires anything like that. Currently, we rely on internal operating procedures and internal regulations within the NSA to restrict their access to that database.
Steve.
In that same discussion with Eric Holder, you pushed the Attorney General to provide some kind of a legal analysis that gives them, in effect, permission to do the kinds of things that we've seen the President do. And Eric Holder came back and said, look, this is in line with what presidents have done for years with respect to executive authority. And if my notes are correct, you pushed back respectfully and forcefully and said you disagreed with the Attorney General and that this was a much broader and deeper reach into executive power than we've seen before. Why do you believe that if the numbers of executive orders are not much greater than they have been in the past? What makes what he's doing so much greater and deeper than what we've seen in the past?
First of all, what he was disregarding is the fact that not all executive orders are alike. You can have an executive order that might be fully authorized by law or fully authorized under the Constitution. And so what I went through with Attorney General Holder was the three-part analysis first developed by Justice Jackson in a case called Youngstown Sheet and Tube versus Sawyer, the steel seizure case. And I went through the three frameworks. You get one scenario where Congress authorizes something, another scenario where Congress is silent, a third scenario in which Congress prohibits something. And I said, which of these three scenarios is this? You know, let's take, for example, the executive order delaying the implementation and delaying the enforcement date for the employer mandate. And he said, well, I think it's probably category 1. And I said, well, what can you give me by way of statute? What can you give me by way of constitutional or statutory authority to do that? He couldn't identify anything. And I said, well, you know, with all due respect, sir, you're the Attorney General of the United States. If the President's going to do this sort of thing, you need to be ready to provide that kind of analysis.
Were you surprised
I don't see anything in the law.
When you asked that question, did you expect him to be able to have an answer for you?
Yes. I mean, this was a very significant alteration of the President's signature legislative accomplishment. The law in this circumstance says X. And the President did Y. The law said that he had to start implementing this on January 1st of 2014, and he said, I'm not going to, not for at least another year.
Elise?
Supporters of the President would say that this is all within his discretion and that we've seen similar examples in past administrations. What do you say to that?
I'd invite them to show me one. I'd invite them to show me even one example that was just like this one. The truth is that this law is pretty unprecedented in terms of its scope. And the actions taken by this president in terms of altering this law again and again and again are themselves relatively unprecedented. To the extent that we can point to instances in history where presidents might have overreached by way of executive order, I condemn them. And I condemn them whether they were issued by Republicans or by Democrats. The fact that some presidents in the past have overreached with executive orders doesn't justify a subsequent abuse of the Constitution.
I understand. When we think about the employer mandate, obviously, or many people would say that it will go into effect. We're not completely sure. We think it will in a year. But would that change the argument in court? We know that Republicans are going to try to prosecute the president based on some of these decisions he's made. Is the idea that the employer mandate will be implemented, does that help the administration?
Well, of course, the law says that the employer mandate will go into effect January 1st, 2014. It's that aspect of the law that I'm concerned about here. It's that aspect of the law that the president is, frankly, flouting.
Traver 009 asks about the status of Congress and if the Republicans can take over the Senate in 2014. One, what do you put the odds on that happening?
I think the odds are decent. I think the odds are slightly in our favor that we could do it at this point. We've got a lot of red state Democrats who are up for re-election in the 2014 election cycle, and we've got a pretty significant issue with Obamacare that is really putting the wind at the back of Republicans who are running in these seats.
Now, there are some Democrats who are, I guess, licking their chops over the prospects of this standoff on the debt ceiling and possibly getting into the same situation over government shutdown, default, that whole back and forth. Back a few weeks ago, Speaker Boehner was asked about the conservative groups on the outside who were funding and talking about and sending out messages about the movement and how the logistics was going to work with that showdown the last time. And here's what he said about it.
They pushed us into this fight to defund Obamacare and to shut down the government. Most of you know, my members know, that wasn't exactly the strategy that I had in mind. But if you recall, the day before the government reopened, one of the people at one of these groups stood up and said, well, we never really thought it would work. Are you kidding me?
He has since said many other things about different conservative groups. Do you sense that there's going to be this loggerheads on this issue in coming weeks?
I don't think so. I don't think it's going to come to that this time around, mostly because I'm not sensing the fight is there. Look, I've stated repeatedly that I think we're playing with fire. Every single time we raise the debt limit without imposing significant structural permanent spending reform, I think we're running closer to that point at which we will no longer be able to afford to pay even the interest on our national debt. And I think the moment that occurs, the American economy and everyone who participates in it will suffer badly. It will most importantly and most significantly affect the poor and the middle class. That's one of the reasons why I think we need structural spending reform attached to a debt limit increase. So if they want my vote, they will attach that to it. I'm still very much in the minority in that, even within my party, and therefore I don't think it's going to come to anything this time around. But I'm going to continue to sound that warning.
Before I get to George, you said that there's a sense that there's more unifying in the Republican Party and not a growing divide. But why then the need for a Tea Party response to the State of the Union address? Why not say Kathy McMorris Rodgers can carry the flag for the GOP?
Well, again, the idea here is to expand the reach of the GOP, to expand the reach of the conservative movement. You've got a lot of people in America who don't feel like they identify particularly well right now with either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And this is a way that some of us within the Republican Party can reach out to those people and offer something new and something different, something that will be appealing to them but also acceptable to the party establishment.
George.
In a recent, much-discussed speech you gave at the Heritage Foundation, you urged conservatives to address the problem of poverty. Most policy thinkers believe the principal driver of policy, particularly poverty, particularly permanent intergenerational transmission of poverty, is family disintegration. The fact that more than 1 in 3 children in America are born to unmarried women, the fact that 72% of African American children are born to unmarried women, all of that. What in the world can policy do to reconstruct disintegrated families?
Well, it can first stop interfering with families. It can get the federal government out of the way so that families and other institutions of civil society can thrive. Whenever the government, especially the federal government, starts to get too strong, when it starts to intervene too aggressively, the muscle of civil society begins to atrophy. And that is the sort of thing that can result in the disintegration of the family along the lines of what you've described. So we can't create institutions of civil society. We can't restore families or churches or synagogues. But government can weaken those institutions. And so the best thing it can do is minimize its profile so as not to weaken those institutions.
But an awful lot of poverty results simply from bad choices. It's fairly axiomatic now that if you graduate from high school, don't have a child until you get married, don't get married until you have a job, your chances of being in poverty are vanishingly small. How can government, again, shape these choices? And do you dispute the fact that it is largely bad life choices that are producing poverty?
Yeah, it certainly is a lot of bad life choices, and some of those life choices happen to be informed or prodded forward by federal policy. There are some federal policies that keep people in poverty by creating poverty traps. An effective marginal tax increase of 90% for somebody who decides to get an entry-level job and go off welfare. There are other federal policies that discourage marriage, and these are the kinds of things that are causing a lot of problems in our society.
M.M. Azal, I think that's his title there, writes in, I'll read it here. I'm a surgeon, saw my first patient yesterday with an exchange plan new this year. She needed urgent surgery, but had no idea that her Blue Cross plan had a $5,000 deductible. She could only afford $20. She had no idea of how the plan worked. We physicians see this as only the beginning of the coming Obamacare mess. I would like the Senator and the panel's comments on how this may play out.
I would agree with the good doctor that we've seen only the tip of the iceberg of the problems with Obamacare. I don't think we have seen anything close to the worst of this law. There are a lot of people who have been lured into supporting this law with the false promise and the expectation that this law will somehow make health care free, that it will make it painless. And in reality, what it is doing is quite the opposite of that. It's making it more expensive and less accessible to the American people.
Isn't there a challenge in getting from, let's say you get the Senate, getting from where you are now with Obamacare to point B, whatever that alternative is? The unraveling of that seems like it would be kind of a challenge from where we are now. Has that been thought about? Is there committee work on that? Are Republicans working on that aspect, unwinding Obamacare?
Oh, sure. Look, we talk about it all the time, and we knew that would be the case. We've known that over the last 4 years or so. And that's one of the reasons why some of us fought so hard against this law and have been doing so for the last 4 years or so. But we are where we are now. The law is in effect, and so the wind-down process will be difficult. But that's why I say there will come a time when Republicans will need to unite behind a single reform plan to replace Obamacare. But right now we need 10 plans, maybe more, and we need to let those plans compete in the marketplace of ideas, and those will help us win elections, and then we can replace Obamacare with something better.
Steve.
You're often talked about as part of the three amigos, you and Senator Cruz and Senator Paul. And I'm interested in your view of what the biggest policy differences between the three of you are when you sit down and have lunch or chat about these things. Where are you different from the other two? And the other two are always mentioned as potential 2016 presidential candidates, and you're not. Are you just not ambitious, or what's the...
Good thing you did that on the online show.
I don't know. I think I've been wondering that. So what's the...
Look, we've got more than enough freshman Republican senators running for president. The last thing we need right now is another one, and I have absolutely no interest in doing that. I don't think that...
Ever?
I don't think now or ever. I'm happy with the job that I've got, and I don't think that means that I'm not ambitious. I think it means that I'm sane.
Okay. And what about policy differences between the three of you?
You know, I'll speak for myself. I focus primarily, most of what I look at goes through the lens of structural federalism and separation of powers. And I start with those questions. Is this an appropriate function for government generally? If so, is this the appropriate function of the federal government? And if so, are we undertaking the policy in question through the appropriate branch of the federal government? And I then approach things from an angle that focuses on how this is going to affect the American people, particularly the poor and the middle class. I think this is a real opportunity for us as Republicans, as conservatives, to show the country that conservatism properly understood is all about compassion. It's all about, most importantly, upward economic mobility, which has always made America great.
So you're not giving me policy differences, are you?
Well,
that was a good answer.
Look, that's my particular focus.
Right.
I think a lot of people would describe Rand Paul as approaching things from a little bit more of a libertarian angle. And Ted Cruz approaches things in many respects the same way that I do, but he hasn't necessarily taken the same approach that I have on the message of civil society, but I think he tends to agree with it. So you're asking me to point to minor differences, and I don't know that there are really significant differences between the three of us. A lot of it just relates to our style and the way we approach things. And again, I'm not running for president, they are.
Oh, that could be news right there. They are?
Well,
I like it. That's good. See,
yeah.
I knew it would lead to something.
Myself into
Just
trouble.
build a little, you know.
They have not ruled out the possibility that they're running for president.
You have.
I have.
Elise.
I was going to ask you a similar question about style. Your star rose so much last summer along with Senator Cruz's, and a lot of hay was made out of the fact that he tended to be in the spotlight so much more than you, and I'm just wondering whether that's a mere difference in personality or if it's also tactical in a certain way.
I don't know. I mean, look, maybe I've just got a face for radio and Cruz has a face for television. I think there are probably some personality differences that produce that sort of disparity, but I don't think about it a lot. I don't spend a lot of time obsessing over who's getting more television time.
George.
There's an issue that gets very little attention here in Washington, but is coming to a boil in the Republican Party base, and it's called the Common Core. And it basically is an attempt by, it's not clear who, to get the states to sign on to common standards for curricula K through 12, grades K through 12. The federal government says, we have nothing to do with this. Indeed, they're forbidden by various statutes to promote curriculum. Others say they're doing exactly that, using incentives, financial and others. Do you have a position on the Common Core? Are you hearing from people about the Common Core? And should the federal government be involved in any way in promoting a national curriculum?
I am hearing about it. A lot of my constituents are very concerned about it. I'm very concerned about it. I think the federal government should have nothing to do with curriculum in the K through 12 arena. I think it ought to stay out of the way. Look, public education works, and it works best when it's managed at the most local level possible.
To be fair, people say that we're just talking about standards, not curricula. The critics say standards will drive curriculums, they will drive textbooks, they will drive the SAT tests and all of that.
They will, and they do. And so you can't say that, you know, the federal government's just participating in setting up a common set of standards and then is stepping back and remaining agnostic from that point forward. That's not how it works. That's never how it works, and it's not going to be how it works here. It's one of the reasons why I've got grave concerns with Common Core.
One of the education pushes that's happening, Senator Alexander and Senator Scott, with this effort for school choice and vouchers, sort of a pushback on inequality, income inequality, saying that that's the biggest way to reduce that gap is by the school vouchers. Do you think that this will become a big issue for Republicans in 2014, and where do you stand?
I do think school vouchers can be an effective tool for opening up the public education system and making quality public education more available to more people at more stages along the economic continuum. I think that this will continue to be appealing to conservatives, and I think it will be a winning issue for Republicans. Whether or not this bill or any federal measure is the answer is open to more debate, and you know, I need to learn more about that particular proposal. I generally think that things like that need to be handled at the state level, but I'm open to looking into that bill.
Steve?
I don't want to go back to something you said earlier about the potential fight about the debt ceiling. You said you're sensing that the fight isn't there. It's that people don't want to have this. Does that mean that Republicans are going to support the raising of the debt ceiling without any conditions, without actually making a fight? Is that the direction we're headed in?
Yeah, that's how it appears to me. That's what I'm sensing. I could be wrong, but that's what I'm sensing.
There's been some talk. Charles Krauthammer, our colleague, wrote a column proposing that Republicans attach, sort of the end of the bailouts for the insurance industry, the risk corridors in Obamacare, to the debt ceiling. Is that something that's the Rubio bill, Tim Griffin in the House? Is that something that's being actively discussed, or is that not really a
Yeah, I've heard that thrown around, and I shouldn't say that I'm not sensing that they will attach. That I'm not sensing that they'll attach anything. I just don't sense that anyone's willing to attach a condition of significant permanent structural spending reform.
Right.
You might see some tinkering around the edges with something like that. I don't know.
But the strategy last time was to pressure Senate Democrats, red state Senate Democrats, to the point where they would then vote with you. That didn't work the last time. Do you think that somehow with the right thing to attach to the bill that it would work this time?
No. I'm not sensing that the fight is there. The president has misinformed the American people by telling the American people over and over and over again that unless Congress responds to his demand by raising the debt ceiling reflexively without any significant conditions attached to it, that is tantamount to a default, that in and of itself will produce a default, resulting in catastrophic consequences to the American economy and indeed to the world economy. I think that's wrong. I think it's legally incorrect for him to say, but it nonetheless has been an argument that's been made so many times that a lot of people have decided to sort of give him a pass on it.
A lot of people here think you should reconsider on the president thing, but George, go ahead.
This may count as tinkering around the edges, but there is substantial bipartisan support, lots of Democrats, in favor of repealing the medical devices tax in Obamacare. Wouldn't that be an ideal vote? A, it might work, and B, it would embarrass a lot of people if they had to then, having already voted to repeal the medical devices tax, they then turned around and voted against repeal.
Yeah, look, I think we should repeal the medical device tax. I don't know whether it will be attached to this or whether it will be attached to something else, but I do think we need to repeal it. I think it was an ill-conceived tax from the outset for a whole variety of reasons, and I think we ought to do away with it.
Last one, Elise.
I think in general, Obamacare seems to have receded from the headlines as the problems with the website have gotten better. People accuse the mainstream media of turning a blind eye to some of the ongoing issues, but certainly on Capitol Hill, it was a firestorm for months and now no longer seems to be that way. Is that something you've noticed as a lawmaker, or is it just us journalists covering the Hill?
I haven't noticed if people have stopped talking about Obamacare. I still see it as a firestorm. I mean, look, I continue to get phone calls and I continue to get letters every single day from constituents talking about how this law is hurting them. Talking about how this law is hurting patients, it's hurting doctors, it's making health care less affordable, less accessible, and it's destroying relationships that people have developed over the course of years with their insurance companies and even with their doctors. So no, I don't think it's going away, and I think it's continuing to get worse.
Senator Lee, thanks so much for your time and for sticking around for online. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's this week's edition. Hopefully you'll join us next Wednesday for the online panel. Control room, a little goodbye.